Expert news and views on the Lowcountry real estate scene. The Brian Beatty Real Estate Show on 1250 WTMA.
Welcome back, folks, as the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show continues here on the Big Talker, 1250 WTMA and WTMA.com. Thanks again for joining me during this holiday weekend as we talk about some scary stories, some horror stories, if you want to call it that, in real estate. What happens when things don't go according to plan? What happens when the other side decides they just don't want to close? That's my first story. Now, we obviously hope that these things never happen to our clients, but you can't control people. And sometimes people make decisions that are not within their best interest, and it's really hard to kind of get them to see rationally the impact of their decision, whether it's our client or somebody else involved in the transaction in some way, shape, or form. And so, obviously, if you'd like to reach out to us and have a conversation about how we, frankly, do our very best to control the aspects of the transaction so that you are informed, you are well taken care of contractually, you're represented in a way that prevents things like this from happening. You have a little fun along the way, too. So if you'd like to reach out to me, you'd like to have a discussion about working with you as your real estate agent, my number is 843-800-0065. That number will come straight to me, 843-800-0065. Or you can check us out online at listingsincharleston.com. That's listingsincharleston.com. So the first story that I want to share is something that happened to us this year. Obviously, with these stories, I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to name property addresses. But I do want to share the story because you need to understand, as a listener, somebody that's going to engage in some form of a real estate transaction at some point in time, what happens when things like this happen to you. And so here's the situation. We represent a buyer. It's a first-time home buyer. They have been renting for their entire lives and finally have kind of come to the decision that, you know what, I'd rather be a homeowner than a lifelong renter. And so over the course of several months, we work with these folks to improve their credit, to position themselves financially to be able to do this. And we're getting the sense throughout the transaction that communication is just not their strong suit. You know, we would say some things and then we'd have to repeat those things that we said. And, you know, throughout the entirety of the process, we're being patient. We're happy to repeat ourselves. We're happy to share the same information that we'd already shared. Sometimes it's just needed. And I get it. Real estate is a high stress transaction. You know, there are plenty of agents out there that promise a stress-free transaction. First of all, nobody can promise a stress-free transaction. And then secondly, I've never had a stress-free transaction, and I've done over 1,200 of them. It's just stressful. You're moving from one location to another, hoping that everybody's going to do their part and that nothing happens along the way that is outside of your control. Well, in this particular instance, this buyer that we're representing, we start to get some signs that, you know, maybe this isn't going to go through. But even though they are reluctant, they are forging ahead. So we're under contract in a house, moving toward closing. We get through the inspection. We get through the appraisal, the underwriting for the loan. All of it goes well. A few days before closing, the agent on my team, the buyer, and the lender are all having a conversation about kind of the one of the, if not the final conversation before closing, which is, hey, let's just review one more time everything that you're going to need in order to close later this week. Here is the cashier's check that you need. We've been over that. Or you can wire the funds into the closing attorney. You need to bring this, that, and the other to the closing. You'll do a final walkthrough with your agent, and boom, you'll be a new homeowner. Well, they have a conversation with the agent, and the buyer basically says, okay, well, let me think about it, which is, you know, you always get a little concerned when, you know, here we are like 2 days before closing. We're like, okay, well, let me think about it. What's there to think about? These are just the details that you need in order to close. And so we get concerned. Closing day rolls around. We've not heard from the buyer in 48 hours. The agents are like, hey, what's going on? The listing agent, the seller, they're like, is there going to be a problem? Is there a holdup? What's the cause for the delay? And we just have to say, we don't know. We can't reach the buyer. Well, the closing day comes and goes. Still haven't heard from the buyer. And then the next day, the seller and the listing agent send in a termination of agreement, right? The buyer is now in default. They didn't close on time. And so they send a notice of default. They send in a termination agreement, rewarding the earnest money back to the seller because the buyer defaulted on the contract. They didn't close on time. They didn't let us know why there was a delay. And then we just get a little text message the next day from the buyer saying, hey, we thought about it and it's just too much cash for us to close. And to them, I understand it was a lot of cash. In the grand scheme of real estate transactions, it was a very small amount of cash. But at the end of the day, the buyer chose not to close on the property. It's the first time that has ever happened to our team in over 1,200 transactions here locally. And it's bound to happen sooner or later, right? So you can't control other people. All you can do is provide them with the information, help them make an informed decision, and the impact of their decisions or indecisions. So in an instance like this, when a buyer chooses not to close, they just straight up default on the contract, I think the idea is that from the buyer's perspective, the only thing that they were at risk of losing was their earnest money. Well, unfortunately, in South Carolina, when you default on your sales contract, a lot of people think that the only loss is the deposit or the earnest money, but this is not the law in South Carolina. When a buyer refuses to close on a binding sales contract, they are liable to the seller for all of the general and specific damages resulting. So it's not just the earnest money that buyer ran the risk of losing. What are some of the other things that the seller may be able to collect out of the buyer, assuming they are a collectible individual, right? That they have the money to pay these types of things. Well, here's a list. Interest payments on the mortgage, assuming there is one. This is the seller's mortgage, right? Property taxes, utilities, insurance, moving expenses, any loss from a subsequent lower sale. If your home is under contract for $400,000 and the buyer decides to not close, and then the only reasonable amount that you can get for your home is $385,000, guess what? That buyer that defaulted on that contract could be liable for that $15,000 difference. In addition to all the holding costs associated with that real estate, the appraisal fees, and the seller's closing fees. And on top of that, you might have the real estate agents say, hey, you should have closed. I'm suing you for my commission. So there's a lot at stake when a buyer chooses not to close on a property. If you didn't know that, now you know. It's a major risk. And usually, we've had plenty of instances. Don't get me wrong, dozens, maybe 100 plus instances where a buyer threatened not to close. Maybe they wanted something. Maybe they were kind of building up the contract until the very end so that they could make sure that the seller moves out of the house, gets into this vulnerable position, and then tries to take advantage of that situation. And I've got another story that I'll share on just that here in just a minute. But I want you to understand that when a buyer defaults on a contract and you as the seller then terminate it, you request their earnest money. You can't unilaterally take earnest money in South Carolina. There has to be a sign-off on where the earnest money goes, either to the buyer or to the seller. Both parties have to agree to that. So, in this instance, the buyer, ended up giving the seller the earnest money. But there are some buyers that just disappear off the face of planet Earth, and you can't get them to sign the release of contract. Well, thankfully, you have the ability to just terminate the agreement, right? If they're in default, you can terminate the agreement. But sometimes buyers and sellers get into fights over who's going to get the earnest money, even if one party is clearly at fault. And so the law states that both parties have to agree as to where that earnest money goes, who that earnest money goes to. And if they can't, then it will be handled in a court of competent jurisdiction. A lot of sellers don't want to wait that long. So usually there's some sort of negotiation that happens over earnest money, as ridiculous as that might be. Even if another party is completely at fault, the seller might not want to run the risk in taking the amount of time it's going to take to not only battle for the earnest money, but then go through the process of suing them for damages for all those things that we just discussed: interest rate payments on the mortgage, property taxes, utilities, insurance, moving expenses, appraisal fees, seller closing costs, and any loss from a subsequent lower sale. This is why writing bulletproof contracts is really important. And the real estate agent that you work with, and frankly, the team that you work with, the lender, the inspector, the contractor, and the closing attorney, are all top-notch people, so that if some sort of issue arises throughout the course of this transaction, you're working with a true, seasoned, experienced professional that has been there, done that, knows how to solve the problem. And if you're working with a really good one, they know how to find the problem and avoid it altogether. In most instances, obviously, like I said, you can't control everything, and we're dealing with human behavior and a lot of emotion in these real estate contracts. It's always unfortunate to share stories like this, but you as the listener get to benefit from what happens, and you get the knowledge and the understanding of, if that, God forbid, were to ever happen to you, what are your rights? What does that look like? I'm going to share another story with you when we come back. Stick around. This is the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show on the Big Talker 1250 WTMA and WTMA.com. And remember, if you want to reach out to me and have a discussion about working together to help you buy, sell, or invest in real estate, or maybe you own a property and you want to hire a really good property manager, we can help you with that. My number is 843-800-0065. That's 843-800-0065. Or you can always visit us online at listingsincharleston.com. Stick around, folks, for more of the Brian Beatty Real Estate Show here on the Big Talker 1250 WTMA and WTMA.com.
Have a real estate question? Ask Brian Beatty. Send him an email, lowcountryhomesales@gmail.com. The Brian Beatty Real Estate Show is on 1250 WTMA.